Utah was shaped by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whose early pioneers settled the region all to avoid religious persecution. But what happened when the very first Protestant church dared to plant its flag in the heart of Mormon Territory, a defiant act that served as the very first non-LDS church and the very first anti-Mormon church in the Utah Territory? This little sliver of church history and what it's like today may end up surprising you. My name is David. Welcome to Church Visit number 38 of 52 Churches in 52 Weeks, Round 3, a spiritual project born out of curiosity, faith, and an appreciation for church stories. Over a year ago, I found myself making a few trips out to Utah to get a crash course on everything Latter-day Saints, from visiting historic Latter-day Saint ward chapels to temple open houses, and also some of the various sites that paid tribute to the men and women who dared to venture out west into the wild unknown, all due to their religious convictions. One night, a few blocks away from Temple Square, I found myself looking up at the Cathedral of the Magdalene. This is the mother church of the Roman Catholic Church diocese in Salt Lake City. And after that evening, after witnessing a Vespers service, it sparked a curiosity about what the relationship was like between Catholics and Latter-day Saints in the state of Utah, especially just this mutual understanding, this mutual respect of the persecution that both faith groups had received from Protestants, especially in the 19th century. So if the Cathedral of the Magdalene served as this permanent home for Catholics in Salt Lake City and in Utah, it got me wondering, what was the very first Protestant church in Utah, and what happened as a result, especially because of so much persecution that was involved? Enter the First Congregational Church of Salt Lake City. Like its name implies, First Congregational was a church of firsts. Established in 1865, it wasn't just the very first Protestant church in Utah, it was a bold statement of religious independence. It was founded by a military chaplain named Reverend Norman McLeod, and he was a fiery anti-Mormon preacher. His church quickly became a hub for non-Latter-day Saint settlers, nicknamed Gentiles, and his church essentially served as a voice of dissent. But as the years progressed, First Congregational became something much more, and it founded Utah's first free public schools, thus leaving its mark on Utah history. Now, fast forward to 160 years later to this very day, this congregation and its mission are vastly, vastly different. Last year, I made a visit to First Congregational Church on Foothill Drive. And as you can tell with the beginning in this video, the Meetinghouse is just absolutely falling apart with several doors boarded up, caged all over. And I understand the property has been sold to make room for apartments in the future. A little down the street, the downsized congregation now meets at a parish hall at All Saints Episcopal Church. So I went inside, curious to learn a little bit more. I attended the service. I'm going to show you just a brief minute of what the worship service looked like and sounded like, and then I'll be back to touch much more on this church history. You may be wondering, David, what exactly is a congregational church? Well, as its name implies, the church is run and governed by the congregation itself. There is no centralized authority. This all happened in 16th century England during these Puritan protests of the Church of England. And by having the church kind of run all the affairs, that this was a radical idea back then. So as a result, you had a number of congregational pilgrims that were being persecuted, and they were like, enough of this, we're out of here. We're sailing to the Americas on the Mayflower and to this whole new promised land. They set up the Plymouth colony in 1620, and Congregationalism became a defining force in New England, and that helped to shape the cultural and the religious landscape in early America. So how exactly did a Protestant congregational church end up in Utah? Well, it was largely due to military reasons to protect the mail. I'll try to expand on that. So in 1862, Utah was defined by its Latter-day Saint faith. Brigham Young was the president of the church. 50,000 Latter-day Saints had settled in the Utah Territory. And at this same time, the Civil War is raging on. Abraham Lincoln is the president. And just for anyone that is not of the LDS faith in Utah, whether you're Protestant, Catholic, even Jewish, you were considered a Gentile. That same year, 1862, Fort Douglas gets established just outside of Salt Lake City. It was named Fort Douglas after Senator Stephen A. Douglas, who interestingly enough had defeated Abraham Lincoln in Illinois to become a senator all before Lincoln became president. So with Fort Douglas, this essentially was set up as a military outpost to protect mail routes against Indian attacks is what they had you believe back then. So at that time, the Gentile community, this kind of brought on a presence of peace, of comfort, of security, and of hope, because for the first time, they kind of had a U.S. cavalry right there in their backyard. To serve the military personnel and other non-LDS settlers, Reverend Norman McLeod was assigned as the military chaplain at Fort Douglas. In January 1865, he held the first non-LDS religious service in Salt Lake City, and by all reports, it was a very, very anti-Mormon sermon. His title for the sermon was called, "Can Anything Good Come Out of Nazareth? Come and See." And within a month, the church was formally organized as the First Church of Jesus Christ of Utah, with Congregational added in parentheses. And by mid-year, its Sunday school had grown to 150 people. So with that large enough of a congregation, they built its first permanent home, Independence Hall. And this building, completed in November 1865, it became a hub for the Gentile community, hosting not just congregational services, but also would host Catholics, Episcopalians, and even Jews before they could eventually build their own religious buildings. So McLeod's sermons, they remained very anti-Mormon. And in 1866, after the Civil War had wrapped up, McLeod was losing resources at Fort Douglas. So he traveled to Washington, D.C. to lobby to get more resources and also to report on the growing Mormon problem. So there are some reports of this online called The Condition of Utah. And in Reverend Norman McLeod's report, he talks about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. He talks about Brigham Young, his concerns about endowments. And just as McLeod is headed back to Utah to continue his ministry, he learns that the superintendent of his Sunday school had been assassinated. As a result, he decides to postpone his return, and the Congregational Church essentially goes inactive. 6 years later, McLeod finally returned to Utah in 1872, and he essentially renewed his attacks on Mormonism. In October, he started a sermon series going after polygamy, more Mountain Meadows Massacre concerns, other topics, and eventually, within a year, he finally had to resign, presumably due to his sermons increasing tensions yet again. After McLeod left, First Congregational Church took a different approach by instead bettering the community through free education. So at the time, there was no free public education in the Utah Territory. There were a few private schools that would charge tuition fees. So First Congregational Church instead in 1878 introduced free public education that really was an effort to kind of win over Utah's children, especially Latter-day Saint children. So by 1890, Congregationalists had founded 36 different schools across the state and enrolled 2,500 students annually. The staff was largely consisted of women from eastern states. The number of congregational schools eventually started to decline after 1890 just due to a number of different factors, and the last school closed in Utah in 1920. The church continued to endure heading into the early 20th century. In 1892, they built a brand new church building, and essentially they continued to expand its outreach to support and establish other congregations in the state of Utah. Now, here's where things get a little murky. I was talking with some church members who had grown up as a part of this church after the church service that I attended, and I was trying to take what they were giving me and comparing it to some online research. So here's kind of what I gathered. In 1958, they hired this very charismatic preacher, and at the time, they were the board of trustees that contained a number of bankers were assessing what was needed to repair their current church building. And they decided instead to move out to this new location on Foothill Drive, essentially take out a mortgage, buy some land, start up construction. And obviously with bankers, there's kind of an incentive for you to do that. So they built their current huge meeting house. And there were two distinct features from what I was reading. There was this beautiful memorial stained glass window called the Walk to Emmaus that they put inside the sanctuary. And they also put in and moved this huge pipe organ, by accounts from the church, was the largest organ in Utah. I'm not sure if that's true or not, considering the Tabernacle Choir, but that's what they're saying in their research. So from this point forward, this charismatic preacher held their Easter service 100 years after the first service in 1965. And then a year or two later, he was out. Apparently, he may have taken a bigger paycheck somewhere else. And as a result, this brand new, beautiful church building now had lost its charismatic preacher. And as a result, this church kind of had to contain the ship, so to speak, so attendance didn't dip too much. Fast forward to 2022, just a few years ago, the pandemic had really shrunk this congregation. And unfortunately, the congregation had to make the decision to sell the property. And with the building falling into disrepair, the cost of maintaining it was just simply too high. Now, the congregation has downsized and they meet at this parish hall at the nearby All Saints Episcopal Church right down the street. For a very small recap, I had no problem finding First Congregational Church in the parish hall of All Saints Episcopal Church. I will say it's a little odd to have two different churches kind of going around the same time frame. Even though the congregation wasn't many, I estimate maybe 30 people in total. I will say that I was struck by the warmth of this congregation. I had a number of people who, just walked up to me or turned around their seats just to welcome me as a part of their church for that Sunday. I was one of the youngest ones in attendance. There was probably only one other younger married couple that was there that assisted with the music. And towards the later end of the service, a young single mom walked in with her newborn, and she sat next to her mom. And the baby started to cry. And I do recall the pastor and even the congregation just finding joy at just these cries of a baby inside their congregation, because the average age here was at least 60 to 65 years old. Half of the congregation also sang in the choir. I don't remember a whole lot because considering this was a year ago, but the sermon, the pastor was using this book from Tim Keller, the former pastor at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, and a lot of the sermon was geared around social justice. After service, they had this whole table made out with St. Patrick's Day. I sat and chatted for about 10 minutes and kind of learned a little bit about the history of the church from those church members. And then I had to take off because my flight was going to take off in about an hour and a half. So real small recap, but that's what my experience was like at First Congregational. Perhaps the most poignant part of First Congregational's story is what happened to its artifacts after its building was sold. The church distributed or sold parts of its sanctuary to those who could give it new life. And one of these pieces was that stained glass window I mentioned earlier called the Walk to Emmaus. In a remarkable turn of events, according to the Salt Lake Tribune, the window was going to a new home with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to be used in an entryway of a temple. Now, I cannot find or confirm which temple received this window, if any. I understand in the Manhattan, New York temple, there's a Walk to Emmaus stained glass window in its entryway that was made by Tom Holdman, but that doesn't look like it's the same one. And for this particular one from First Congregational, I don't know if that has been commissioned or not. If you know anything, feel free to mention it in the comments below, because if it has been commissioned at a temple, I would love to know which one. If it is true, you'd have to think about that for a moment. A window from the First Protestant Church in Utah, one that was founded in part to challenge Latter-day Saint faith, to be given to an entryway to be used for a temple, is absolutely remarkable to think about. It's a powerful symbol of just how time can transform any type of relationship, turning moments of tension, like what was happening in the 19th century, and then to use that into opportunities for reconciliation and shared heritage. We're going to wrap it up on that. Hope you enjoyed this look into First Congregational Church in Salt Lake City. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe. Also hit notifications for future visits. If you want to support the channel, don't support me. Help support those in need with our St. Jude Children's Research Hospital fundraiser. In our last video, we hit the halfway point with $26,000 raised towards our goal of $52,000 by the 52nd and final church. So for all of those that have contributed for this amazing cause, want to say thank you very much. But until next time, hope you have a good one.